Midnight Lands is a Morin Academy podcast about the past, present, and future of Catholicism. Welcome to another episode of Midnight Lands. For this episode, we're honored to have on the YouTuber Apostolic Majesty, who covers all things related to the history of political theology. We're here specifically to talk about ultra-royalism and Introuvability. So to start us out, AM, could you tell us about what ultra-royalism is and how you came to identify as one?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Spencer, for having me on your podcast. As for identifying as an ultra-royalist, I put out a brief article explaining what ultra-royalism is, and of course that'll be unpacked over the course of the interview. But there's very little point in really identifying as one other than trying to be instructive for the people listening, because what I do is not any sort of form of political advocacy. Really, what I'm trying to emphasize with my work is looking at so many confected political labels like conservative, right wing, even reactionary, and saying that these are all, I'm not even going to say necessarily colloquialisms, but perversions of language. If to make a really base example, it's almost like taking the word figuratively, misusing it to mean literally, to the point that the dictionary changes its definition to mean the exact inverse of what it's supposed to be, to the point that if you're going to identify as whatever, a conservative sort of history lens or whatever, right wing or whatever, all of these terms seem increasingly nebulous and not effectively damaging to whatever you're going to present. So really what ultra is, down to its sort of most basic level, is the idea of reaching beyond institutions and things as they manifest in the present, but beyond that, looking further and associating it with the idea of the sacred versus the profane. You can say that an issue of looking at history is that it is almost exclusively focused with the profane. Whatever aspect of the sacred is manifested through the profane in terms of how we understand history. And so ultra, and by extension attach it to any sort of ideology you have, but in this case ultra royalism, is actually a way of maintaining a balance between having one foot in the sacred and one foot in the profane. In terms of secularizing this, you can say that you can take the idea of ultra and subsume it into the idea of sacred principles, not just an idea of God or the manifestation of the divine in various events. So it's a complicated idea to really wrestle with. And in terms of designating it as a label, as something I would go around and saying, oh, well, I'm an ultra, is completely meaningless, because no one is going to have any idea what I mean by that. So in so many respects, it's simply about education, instruction. It's supposed to try and bring people into an understanding of the past and abandoning, say, for example, all notions of presentism, which is the thing as is effectively true conceptually of all time.
Mhm. And what would you say to people that would say either, okay, you have this very refined perspective, but at the end of the day, aren't you making yourself practically and intellectually irrelevant by being so grounded in the beyond or what you take to be the beyond? I would think that would be the best level of the argument, and a lower level would be like, well, what makes you different from like a nihilistic Marxian that wants the ruthless critique of everything existing, and the profane can never be made sacred or valued because you're always searching for something beyond ultra.
Well, it would be nihilism if you're trying to situate the sacred in the profane, which of course would be a contradiction in terms, but this is about understanding history. History is the study of change. As for sort of any moral meaning you can sort of discern from that, that seems to be extra historical. So when Cicero would, again, in his polemics and his oratory, try and understand morality and political virtue through history, in many ways, what he was doing is looking at the history of the world as the instructive lesson, which in itself is extra historical. It's someone interpreting history and feigning it, reorganizing it for whatever intention he has. That's why history, in terms of understanding any sort of through line for it, is so complicated. But going back to your original point as to how this sort of pertains or has any relevance, it is relevant if you want to have any understanding of the past which has a fidelity to the past. If you're abandoning any notion of the sacred, if you're abandoning any notion of, again, just sort of to refine the idea of ultra even further, you can look at it again as this definition between the profane and the sacred, but there's an added element to it, which is about theoretical sophistication and looking at an institution as what it should be, or you can say even further, trying to look at the essence of a thing simply than looking at the state of the thing as it currently exists. I think this is part of the reason I have an issue with existentialism, is that existentialism looks at essence as post hoc, whereas someone like me and someone looking at altruism, whatever that means, will tend to look at essence as preceding existence. In which case, you can look at a extant thing and say that it's deviated so much from the intention, the origins, the purpose of whatever this is supposed to represent, to the point that it has become an absolute contradiction. It has become an oxymoron. If you try and divorce that connection between essence and existence, between the sacred and profane, I would almost say it's more nihilistic because you're stuck in an eternal moment in the present in which all ideas are changing, all principles are malleable, and the only thing you're basically in service to is a slavery to time itself.
Right. And so then to take a half step back, your argument is if you aren't, for lack of a term, a royalist, or sorry, an ultra essentialist, then all of the people that think that they're right wing or conservative or reactionary or what have you are in their own way these kind of modernist existentialists who are trying to put a patina of tradition or pre-modern realism onto their project. I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yes, unfortunately, I wish that weren't the case in terms of looking at the evolution of conservatism. But if you go back to the origin of modern conservatism is reactive in the purest and most pejorative instance, in that it sees the event occurring and is simply about harnessing or maintaining fidelity to certain aspects of a thing which hasn't yet been completely dissolved. So, in the case of Edmund Burke, it was looking at what the English Constitution, say, for example, should defend against the rampant iconoclasm of the French Revolution. Instinctively, the whole idea of conservatism is to conserve, it is anti-iconoclastic. But the issue is that once you have a situation like the French Revolution, where so much ground has been pushed by one side of the argument, this is where the term left and right is actually really useful because it only exists in a left wing, sorry, in a post revolutionary paradigm. Left tend to be more extremist in terms of the pursuit of their ends, and invariably they have a more purist conception of what they want to achieve. It's almost like the inverse of altruism because the left, in its sort of purest, most violent form, agitates for the essence which basically exists after existence. It is the pursuit of the earthly utopia, whereas the ultra, by contrast, I would say, is far more skeptical about the state of the universe. One figure which I routinely come back to is the figure of St. Augustine of Hippo, because he weds his whole understanding of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire to the conception of the two cities, one city situated in heaven, one city situated on earth. The corporeal institution, the earthly institution may change, it may become distorted, it may die, but effectively it may recoalesce in some form so long as it has some connection, some fidelity to the heavenly institution. So going back to sort of the whole notion of the conservative, if you're looking at the institution post hoc, if you're saying that there is, say, for example, a kitsch value associated with the monarchy, it inspires, tourism. It inspires a veneration of the country's history or heritage. You're looking at the institution in terms of what it currently is and what elements of it are conducive to what our aims are at the time, and whatever element should be conserved. Whereas if you look before them, to make it even complicated, you will see that so much of this institution has actually withered in terms of those aspects, the preservation of a heritage, an attempt to maintain some sort of historical continuum. So the point is, ultimately, what is conservatism? It seems to be, again, this is rather trite and cliche, but conservatism, again, seems to be, on the one hand, if you're going to put it in very positive language, conserving the gains of their opposition. And if you're going to take a more negative perspective, they're actually fully in alignment with their ostensible opposition. They're simply advocating a more moderate means of attaining those goals.
Right, or hitting the cliche of conservatism as liberalism driving the speed limit.
Precisely.
Yeah. But so if I imagine, what would you say to just a kind of normal Tory who doesn't view, or in America, Republicans, that they think that at least in theory they can grant all of these historical ambiguities and compromises and decadences, but they would say nevertheless we have to be wedded to some school and some political party that gives us the only sort of foothold for a return to pre-modernity or to a genuine ultra-hood, if you will.
Well, I think again, this goes back to the enduring relevance of history and charting the specific evolution of a political party. It's very interesting mentioning the Tories in this country because Toryism as a political movement is effectively dead. Even mainstream political pundits are essentially of the view that whatever party is going to emerge in the next general election, it won't be the Tory party. Unless the Tory party attach themselves to another political movement, they're effectively dead in the water. So it's not even a matter of speaking at this on the conceptual level in terms of the emptying of any substance or principles of Toryism, but it's simply the fact that not only is the organization internally dead, but it's also visibly dead in all sort of forms that matter in terms of political manifestations. When it comes to Republicans, it's a bit more complicated because, as you know, the Republicans don't come from a high Tory heritage, which, as far as people are concerned, the history of the Tory party goes back all the way to the 17th century, revolving around something called the exclusion crisis, which doesn't really pertain that much to the conversation. But needless to say, over the following several centuries, Toryism, in terms of what it is, fractures, its ideology becomes more confused. Many elements within the Tory movement betray the movement to their political opposition. And so by the time you get to the 19th century, there seems to be a very earnest attempt by some Tory politicians to actually capture an essence of what was lost in high Toryism in the previous century. And ultimately, they fail completely in that enterprise. And I would say they fail completely because it is fundamentally conservative. It's attached to conserving the institution as is, as opposed to really trying to reify the institution as how it ought to be. In terms of looking at figures like Benjamin Disraeli, it really never gets beyond the conceptual stage. It never sort of manifests as a comprehensive program of political action. For the Republicans, they, of course, start as radicals in the American political system. It's the Democrats who, in the 1850s and the antebellum, are seen as the more conservative elements. The whole idea of the Republicans sort of being a conservative party, I would say, is a bit of a bizarre historical mutation because, as you know, they begin as the abolitionist party. After the 1880s, they become a pro-industrialist party, a party of high tariffs. Under McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, they become a pseudo-imperialist party. And by the 1920s, they become a quote-unquote economically laissez-faire party. Really, when we talk about sort of social conservatism and the evangelical wing of the Republican Party, that is something that seems to attach itself later when evangelism really becomes evangelicalism becomes a really strong political force in the late 1880s. So, are the Republicans conservative in a sense? What tradition do they really represent? Do they represent sort of original fidelity to the original constitution of the founders? And then in America, you have the added notion to that: is the American Revolution a conservative thing? Is it something that can be defended on conservative grounds, or is it fundamentally a rebellion against hierarchy, a rebellion against, again, the pre-established state religion, which was Anglicanism, and a revolt against the Hanoverian monarchy? The interesting thing about looking at the trends of conservatism in America is I would say they're almost distinct and have to be held in their own category compared to European modes of thinking, especially French modes of thinking, which tends to be the greatest sort of exploration I have in terms of political theology. It tends to be very situated in continental Europe. And for that reason, I find it almost impossible to draw any broad parallels between quote unquote American conservatism and however it manifests in Europe.
Mhm. Yeah, something I think about a lot is how America is politically such a novel situation, and yet on the face of it, our two political categories refer back to like rudimentary classic political philosophy, and and the big gap between what these words would indicate they are versus like the complex historically developed nature of what they actually are, and then how people bridge that gap and reconcile themselves. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about you alluded to the history of ultra hood, ultra royalism kind of coming out of France. Can you lay out a brief history of that?
Certainly. The French Revolution occurs in 1789. There had actually been a long sort of history of anti sort of absolutist agitation among royalists. To say that in 1789 all royalists were a leviathan who represented a single idea which they wanted to preserve is complete nonsense. Royalism was incredibly diffuse and had no sort of real confident ideological leadership at that time, to the point that shortly after the storming of the Bastille, very early on, it should be mentioned in the French Revolution, a couple of weeks into it, many of the most prominent, you can say, defenders of the quote unquote absolute monarchy go into exile, de Comte d'Artois being the most significant of these, and they become the much despised emigres. But during the course of the French Revolution, it goes through a period of increasing radicalism. Any attempts of compromise with the monarchy fail, and it becomes France a republic. It becomes a radically de-Christianizing republic. And the effects essentially at social engineering and creating a post-Christian state in France fail when the political situation allows for Napoleon Bonaparte to come into power. And he makes some attempt essentially at finding a middle way between the regime that preceded the French Revolution and the revolution itself. So he presents himself as the revolution on horseback. He assumes the title of consul and then emperor in a thoroughly sort of republican sense, as in echoing the Roman Empire. Yet at the same time, he creates a concordat with the Catholic Church, then assumes sort of more medieval Carolingian poses as the empire sort of increases and his authority seems almost akin to that of a second Charlemagne. But all this collapses and the monarchy is restored. But the restoration of the monarchy is an interesting thing. It wasn't a certainty that the monarchy would be restored if Napoleon was deposed. There was a certain faction in the Napoleonic court, and indeed wider European society, that wanted to see the continuation of the Napoleonic system, albeit under a regency under his infant son Napoleon II, who would later be known to history as the Duke of Reichstadt. The persons really responsible for preventing that happen are one Marshal Marmont and Charles-Maurice Talleyrand, the former foreign minister of Napoleon. These two figures effectively surrender the city of Paris to the coalition forces and then convince the leader of the coalition forces, the Tsar of Russia, Alexander, to allow for the restoration of the monarchy, the restoration of Louis the 18th, the brother of Louis the 16th. And this creates a problematic situation. Louis the 18th had been a rather passive observer of the fighting going on against the revolutionaries in France. You had the war in the Vendée, you had the Chouannerie, you had an incredibly violent, and some people have even accused it of being a genocidal campaign against French conservatives and French monarchists. The Comte d'Artois gets involved in the fighting, but Louis the 18th is basically content to let others do the fighting for him, and they then be received back into France as its rightful monarch. And in order to confirm that, he issues a manifesto which creates a new Chamber of Deputies. What further imperils the regime is that Napoleon then comes back, and as would be expected at that time, Louis XVIII immediately goes into exile, but he comes back and he restores that temporary regime which had a parliament created in the year of 1814 before Napoleon's return. And this creates a major schism in the royalist movement in France. Many people were looking at the momentum, the anti-Bonapartist momentum created by Napoleon's failed Waterloo campaign, the needless bloodshed, and the idea that there were traitors in the ranks throughout all of France, not just crypto-Bonapartists, but crypto-republicans. This leads to the execution of Marshal Ney, who had been perhaps the most dramatic of the traitors of the Restoration government to Napoleon, when he and his regiment, having essentially decided that they were going to bring Napoleon back in an iron chain, an iron cage, decided to become one of the most significant figures in the 100 Days, and of course the general perhaps with the greatest responsibility for leading and losing the Battle of Waterloo. The momentum is towards a much stronger, consolidated, reactionary restorationist regime behind the king, one that has no time for compromise with the Bonapartists and the revolutionaries. Some historians have even attempted to label this as the White Terror, as if again to create a parity with the Revolutionary Terror, but they've completely failed in terms of building that association in the popular imagination. And that is the moment when there is an election held which produces a almost unanimous royalist majority. They look at the institution to which they've been elected to, and they call it the Introuvable Chamber. They will not recognize it because they believe that this institution needn't exist. All we need to do is restore all the powers to the king in a bout of, you can say, ideological enthusiasm and popular approval that was almost unprecedented in the previous 30 years, and indeed in all of French history since. Instead, the king decides to go along with the institution of parliament, and he decides to send most of the radicals among the royalists packing. And so it creates this ideological diffusion. The ultras, who see the institution as it should be, effectively from their point of view, which is that of believing in divine right monarchy, believing that we shouldn't concede these representative institutions, which are the legacy of the revolution. Compare that with the king, whose first goal, this is a stated goal, this wasn't a pejorative label to him, was that he could remain king to the point that he could die in his bed a king. And he achieved that. And for that reason alone, a lot of historians have looked at Louis XVIII positively, and his successor, the leader of the royalist faction, Charles X, negatively. It is again supposed to be an analogy or a metaphor for how political radicalism doomed the Restoration period, whereas moderation, of course, would have saved it in the long term. Of course, the whole idea of introuvability, if you're going to use that as a terminology or any sort of label, or altruism, is saying that what is the point of a restoration that restores nothing?
Subsequent to that, do you find any ultras or introuvables out there that manifested as any kind of political movement that took power, or would you specifically ground this perspective in what happened in there?
Well, Oswald Spengler, in terms of trying to, his relationship with history is complicated, but one of the identifiers, and I think one of the elements which acts as a bit of a presage for conceptual history is that he believed that history is only useful in terms of looking at history as poetical symbols. Looking at the situation in France in the Restoration period in 1815 up until 1830 is a situation which deals with much, you can say, of the issue of quote unquote conservative or reactionary thought, is dealing with a fundamental epistemological and paradigmic shift in politics to the point that the world in the 1780s and the world in the 1790s might as well exist in two completely different universes. And yet there is a momentum building for some sort of corrective measure to the extremism which is represented by the revolution. The first manifestation of that is in Bonapartism, but Bonapartism fails due to its excessive warmongering posture, and instead it allows for the idea of a real restoration, not just of a republican, quote unquote, again, compromise regime that we see under a revolutionary general like Bonaparte. It should also be mentioned that many people in France at the time, royalists and moderates, looked at Napoleon not as a lasting regime figure. They looked at Napoleon as equivalent to a general Monk in England. For reference, in England, you have the English Civil War. You have Oliver Cromwell. He dies and is succeeded by his weaker son, Richard Cromwell. And it is a revolutionary general, General Monk, who allows essentially for the model army to defect and for Charles II, the son of the executed king, to come back and restore the monarchy. Many of the restorationists and the Catholic conservatives wanted Napoleon to act in that role. He wanted Napoleon to facilitate the return of Louis XVIII after the radicalism of the revolution, and that didn't happen. So, as you can probably tell, there is so much in terms of context, historical context, and ideas which are being thought of at the time. So many, again, philosophers who are sort of arising out of that environment, whether it be Chateaubriand or de Maistre on the more reactionary side of things, or whether it be figures like Benjamin Constant or Alexis de Tocqueville occupying a far more sort of nebulous position, looking at the legacy of the French Revolution. And to say that there is an element of the Introuvable chamber, there is an element of this ultra posture which affects all of post French revolutionary reactionary thought. All of the attempts at basically consolidating regimes under quote unquote conservative leaders in the 19th century, and it should also be mentioned for a great deal of the 20th century, was an attempt to deal with the legacy of the French Revolution. The Restoration was just one such example, and for me, it basically serves as a symbol of that struggle. But you see it in Russia with an attempt basically to stamp out liberalism in Russia during the Decembrist crisis. You see it even in Prussia under Bismarck, albeit in Bismarck, conservatism takes on a Lutheran pietist disposition, as opposed to somewhere like in Austria, where it takes on again a more monarchical Catholic posture. In Austria, it's even more interesting because it's the defense of the monarchical institution as representing a multitude of quote unquote nations, in which the only thing that links us all together is fidelity to the dynasty, fidelity to the Habsburgs. Even when these regimes begin to collapse in the after of the First World War, you still see attempts across the political spectrum, whether it be witnesses to the French Revolution and to the Russian Revolution, whether it be the Action Française and the Union Sacrée in France, or whether it be the Conservative Revolution in Germany, or even you can say elements of clerico-fascism in Italy. All of these elements, you can say, are trying to pick apart various pieces, residues of a post-revolutionary paradigm, and they're trying to pick it up and they're trying to refashion it into something which approximates something that is sort of truer of a longer durée in history. So, for example, in the case of Mussolini, he basically thought the perfect way to create an Italian identity was to adopt the principles of an older Italian identity, that being the Roman Empire. In the case of Charles Maurras, he believed that the restoration of France would necessarily involve returning to the principles of Louis XIV or even perhaps before, looking to the monarchical history that we see in the medieval period. Germany is, I would say, a far more complicated case of that, because Germany is both a revolutionary concept and yet is also an archaic concept. It brings forth these ideas of the restoration of the Holy Roman Empire. It is also, as we see under Nazism, one of the most radical exponents of um, racial Darwinism that we will see in history. So again, trying to fit all these things together, none of them really mesh. All of them represent their own historical traditions. All of them are appealing to something. Taken together, they're a mess. None of them, you can say, represent a core coherent policy. This is why looking at the right, this is why looking at broad labels like fascism goes back to my idea at the beginning. It's when you use literally so much that literally becomes figuratively. These words don't really mean anything because there's so many internal gradations within all of these things. The only thing you can say that really unites all of these groups is a desire essentially to go beyond the revolutionary paradigm with which they've been presented. And so in that way, it's almost useless to look at ultra as a political label. It really represents, again, a intellectual posture, an intellectual posture which is so much rooted in history and which is seeking to find the essence in things. As far as I'm concerned, altruism again has to go back to this idea of the sacred, because without a notion of the sacred, there is no sense of the everlasting. Because from my point of view, history is all about the continuous march of change. So long as history is change, then all of these ideas, whether it be an attempt to create a new Italian identity, whether it be the monarchical medieval constitution in France, whether it be National Socialism in Germany, or the conservative revolution, Ernst Junger, whether it be the white movement in Russia, Dengel, Peter Wrangel, Ilya Repin, even you can say Eurasianism and Duginism, all of these organizations are wedded to a notion of the eternal change in history. Again, that's the paradox. The only eternal aspect of history is change in and of itself. And so all of these things will wither and die. The only thing essentially that we can appeal to is the trans-historical essence, is the notion of looking beyond and finding an aspect of the sacred. So again, I find it fascinating trying to sort of look at history and see all these attempts basically at historical reenactment, or these intellectual argumentations and conceptual paradigms from which people can attempt to fashion a concreted identity. When you look at the case with the ultras in France again in the Introuvable chamber, they were attempting to appeal to the essence of a monarchy. But my own argument is that whatever essence that monarchy had been thoroughly debauched in the preceding century that comes up to this period. So ultra and the Introuvable chamber doesn't represent simply the attempt to refashion something that was ancient, is not reactionary in that sense. Rather, it is also attempting to create the new, which is why altruism, if you take it as a real profane posture, it's always about dealing with the inevitability of change.
And then is the way of dealing with the change to be starting from a position of, I guess, apatheia in the classical sense of you're already suspicious that there's no straightforward or practical way that these things can be enacted. And then hence these historical absurdities of like the Introuvable Chamber is trying to abolish itself because it's an illegitimate institution in the name of monarchy that wants to basically liquidate himself of substance so that he can have nominal political power.
In terms of apathy, I wouldn't say apathy. I would say there's a tragic element. There has to be a tragic element associated with the passage of time, but there also has to be a positive element associated with it. Things decline, but also things remanifest. Part of the whole sort of progress of history as looking at the death, the disentangling, and the recoalescing of things in various different manifestations. And this is why, in order to really look at history as not simply the present, to live in the eternal present, and to have one's entire mental horizon so dominated by the present that it becomes inescapable, looking at the past, looking to the present in reference to the past, but also looking at it with the prospect and hope in the future. All of this requires, again, a fundamental sense of optimism and a fundamental degree of imagination. All of those projects, which I was essentially mentioning, are products of the imagination. And I believe it's also true of all times. Once you suffer a great civilizational catastrophe, a great moral catastrophe, or a revolution, you don't need to even look to the French Revolution to find examples of this. You can look to the 14th century in Europe and see that there was a great sense of loss for a civilization that was in a thorough state of decline. You look at Rome in the 5th century, and you find even that there was, alongside, say, for example, emperors like Honorius and Arcadius, and the period of time we're talking about, St. Augustine of Hippo, there was a palpable sense of the decline of the Roman Empire, and the idea that someone like a Majorian is going to come in and restore the empire. There is, again, a devastating feeling of loss when all of these things seem to dispel, all of these things seem to wither away. But the same organization which was responsible for destroying the last remnant of the Roman Empire in the east, in the west, the Kingdom of Soissons, was conquered by the Merovingians, who in turn become the vehicle for a new European unification and eventually the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne. So I tend to take a very long view of these things. And I think if you understand that history is this tragic sort of process of the manifestation of positive iterations of a thing and then the destruction, devolution, and you can say what is so insidious about modernity and the institutions that survive into modernity is that conceptually they are complete frauds. You know, the monarchy in this country, say for example, is a complete fraud. It doesn't represent anything of, again, what a monarchy sort of historically is supposed to represent, and that sort of goes also for various institutions and monarchies that we see throughout Europe. But even notions like, I'm not even going to say broader notions of like democracy or political constitutions, even ideas such as natural rights and political virtue, all of these things again seem to have become so utterly paradoxical in terms of what we are told these things are, as opposed to what you can say a more naturalistic, a more timeless conception of things is supposed to have them represent. So really, you can say when I'm looking at the ultra sort of posture and looking at it as a idea of looking beyond something, modernity is different to the past in the sense that it represents something which we are all conscious of, as opposed to historically, where in more agrarian society, cities that weren't so civilizations that weren't so urbanized, there was a greater sense of the timelessness of existence, and that if there is a time, it is rotated around the seasons and the coming of the harvest. In modernity, we have become so displaced from that all of time seems to become the vehicle and engine of principle itself. And so I think, therefore, having the posture, the intruvable posture, having the posture of an ultra is even more significant now than it's ever been, in order to try and rescue yourself of the present moment, in order to form a picture of human civilization as a whole and not simply as it is in the current day.
Yeah, a few months ago, Theo Howard over on Two Cities, he did this pretty good podcast where he applied the five stages of get grief theory, and he was applying it specifically to Catholic traditionalism. But the way he talked about it and how you can have these situations where it's like somebody is very, very cynical about the ecclesiastical situation, but then they can be shockingly naive about the political situation. And the terrain, or vice versa. You can have people that are very cynical about politics, but they're like, we just need to appeal to Rome, and Rome is based in whatever. And I bring this up because he frames it as they're in various stages of like anger or denial or bargaining. And when the bitter pill nobody wants to swallow is that there's something like fundamentally wrong with modernity, and all of our attempts to reconcile it are kind of self-defeating. If you have accepted it, and I would submit that you seem to have, and I'm trying to, it appears to people as one of the other stages. They could say you're in denial, or you don't grasp uh, the true way that like our movement is hopefully going to be able to fix things and take things back to pre-modern sanity. Yeah, before we move on, do you want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, so I would say this is, if you're going back to the church, this is why the church finds itself in such a almost unique predicament, is that modernity is so palpable a force, so seemingly again gargantuan, that the church has basically bent over backwards to accommodate it in a way that it never did any sort of previous heresy throughout the church's history. So, for example, in the case of Lutheranism, even though Lutheranism politically was incredibly powerful in the 16th century, it had a lot of backing. The church didn't bend over backward then to accommodate it. And yet, in the state of modernity, the church seems to be making accommodations to a Protestant movement at a time where Protestantism has perhaps never been so inert a threat to Catholicism as it is now. And that's again is not a reflection of the church's posture to other religions so much as the church's posture towards modernity. In the same way, I've uncovered and been looking at things like the Avignon papacy and the dejected opinions of Italian and sort of Roman patriots in the 14th century. And they felt very similar, that the church was basically becoming a alien institution. If there was to be a church, it had to be a Roman church. It had to situate itself within this imperial continuum, going back to figures like Constantine and Theodosius the Great. And if it severed itself from that, it simply became a parochial institution like anything else. So these ideas aren't new in terms of the physical institution of the church and individual popes being corrupt. What is new, I think, again, is the association, the ideological association of the church. And this doesn't go for Catholicism, this goes for effectively everything. I mean, even you just referenced it there. The notion that we all have to deal with is that we are all creatures of modernity. This is why, sort of looking at a historicist reading of things. Historicism, very basically, is just understanding that everything is configured by its historical context, its place in time. So we are all talking about this. I will never claim that I can rescue myself out of modernity because I am a creature of it. I would say almost I'm trying to look at finding some sort of mental breach in which you can see sunlight. You're basically sort of again, to use another analogy, it's like being in a state of drowning but you can still see the sun shimmering through. You're still going to be affected by it, you're still going to be ensconced, you're going to be affected by the water all the way around you, but you can at least see a reflection, a glimmer of something that is beyond this basic state of I'm not even going to say mental incarceration, but in some cases, again, it really does feel like an all-encompassing sense of incarceration to be conscious of and live in a state of modernity.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about conceptual history. I assume you wouldn't totally identify that with historicism, so how is it to be distinguished?
But whether it can be distinguished or not, I think what is significant about conceptual history is that it goes back to just that: concepts, linguistics, language. It understands that whatever we do, whatever sort of period we're informed by, all of our understanding of concepts and the use of our language is fundamentally historicist. And it has a different, you can say, ideological underpinning. You know, what I would basically say, going back to ultra, I would even say that the term ultra is fundamentally distinct in my conceptualization as a symbol within history than how the ultra royalists saw it within their very specific historical context. Another way of looking at conceptual history is understanding that history isn't taking concepts that we have created and then attempting to prefigure the past by labeling these concepts over people who had no conception of them. Rather, it's about trying to understand the concepts that were apparent to the people existing at that time, and in trying to uncover the modes of thought and ways of rationalizing the world that any people had at a particular moment in time. Otherwise, the past becomes incomprehensible. Effectively, the more historically you think and the more theoretically you think about history, the more you attempt to impose broader universal categories retroactively onto history, the less intelligible history becomes, because history, as I mentioned, is the process of change. All of these things are contingent and have an element of oblivion baked into them. And so if you ignore that, then essentially what you will represent is a fad, and a fad of whatever period you seem to be attached to. So there's again another tragic element that sort of seeps into my understanding of conceptual history. But I think it's essential to have conceptual history in order to make the past intelligible. The issue is if you then, which I think has been a sort of subtle element undergirding this conversation, if you then attach things like political action and morality to such a notion, then it becomes meaningless. It basically sort of boils down to an aspect of cultural relativism, where in order to understand and have sympathy with a given people at any time, you can't therefore say that that particular group of people had any sort of preferable conception of how they situated themselves within history compared to any other sort of group of people. So I would say it's essential for the understanding of history. It's essential, I would say, in terms of understanding the modern condition, but it's an intellectual necessity. I would say if you're going to undergird and try to have an entire worldview which is formed by conceptual history, then you actually become a anti-vortex. You become a sort of quantum realm where all of these things are simultaneously true and nothing is. Going back to your point about nihilism, so much about what I'm trying to emphasize with, again, trying to see the sun when you're underwater is trying to escape from this prospect of nihilism, and indeed to be crushed by the construct of the eternal present.
Could you expand a bit on how it feels to potentially be crushed by the eternal subject?
By the eternal present.
Oh, sorry,
Well,
eternal present. Yeah.
this is essentially what I was talking about with the idea of modernity, that what modernity does is that modernity effectively subsumes all previous categories and concepts to itself and creates a disfigured form or a completely paradox or a completely antithetical form to whatever concept that was. Again, going back to the example you mentioned about royalism, royalism is just one instance. Religion is just sort of one instance. Even the notion of toleration is another such instance. How people in the 17th century viewed the concept of toleration is fundamentally different from how we in the state of modernity deal with the concept of toleration. Liberty is another concept which, again, fundamentally is at odds in the concept of modernity compared to how we would consider that. And I think it's because what modernity represents is it's just the displacement of all of these things. If there are religious impulses, if there are impulses towards the sacred in history, in a concept of modernity, again, they become disfigured and they remanifest as a form of religious displacement. And if you look at conceptual history, you also have to understand that conceptual history could not exist at any other time other than in the state of modernity, because people don't think this way typically. People don't think of themselves as living within a series of comparative histories where they have to undergird and understand the perspective of people who they will never come into interaction with in an epoch essentially which is consigned to the point that there is no living memory of that period. I would say even the notion of history, which can be so individualized because it's all about the perception of history and trying to understand these concepts intersubjectively, how people thought and how the historian basically tries to translate these ideas into a form which is communicated to a modern audience. All of these things involve a certain element of distortion. And the more again you try and unpack this sort of thing, it leads into an idea of nihilism. If you try and attach any moral significance to this, or indeed try to ascertain any sort of political activism or significance out of this, indeed, I think I can't escape this. People like me can't escape this because we are again thinking very individualistically about any of these concepts. But the true sort of post-modernity, whatever that means, the true again escape from this concept would necessarily essentially entail the dehistoricization of the individual to no longer think like this. But this again, everything which I'm reflecting is actually the byproduct of a fundamentally, you can say, Christianized worldview and a series of intellectual attitudes that were forming as per this tragic conception of the situation of humanity in the late medieval period, with echoes of it going even to the early church fathers and before to classical antiquity.
Am I right in hearing you say that you're kind of agreeing with the Hegelian thesis that the owl of Minerva, flies at dusk, that consciousness of these things is a post festum affair. You can't be an ultra until the intruvable chamber has failed because they themselves were taking all sorts of historical perspectives for granted? And if not, how would you distinguish yourself from that kind of right Hegelian perspective?
Well, I would say that the right Hegelian perspective actually sort of presages a lot of what we see with phenomenology and Heideggerism. And I think my overall frustration with Hegelianism, and it's again it's something I want to research more into and unpack because I'm no expert in Hegelianism by any stretch of the imagination, but it especially in terms of the implicit sort of progression of history that's seen in a figure like Hegel. Hegel represents an attempt to almost divinize the historical process. Again, it's I would say, an integral aspect to modernity, which is once you have killed God, once you have attempted to displace those impulses into something else, then history becomes the great source of all elements, you can say, of post hoc manifestations of truth. And that is something that I try and desperately avoid and situate and understand, that any attempt to divinize the historical process and divinize the notion of progression itself, in turn, will actually leave you in an inescapable state of modernity. And I think what's even more depressing about all of this is that modernity simultaneously has all these principles associated with time and the progression of time, yet theoretically, modernity itself has lost its enthusiasm. If you look at, you can say, the early moderns, and I mean that in a sense of existing within modernity as opposed to how historians look at the period early modern, which is not what I'm referring to here. You look at the Saint-Simonists, you look at Owen, you look at even Robespierre and figures like that. There is an implicit optimism about the state of the future that we can arrive at, whereas it actually comes from a figure like Rousseau, who I believe is actually a fundamentally pessimistic character. He's pessimistic about the state of modernity. He's pessimistic about the state of the present. And I would say that he simultaneously is an author of modernity in the fact that he wants to escape the ancien regime. And yet at the same time, he is a symptom, you can say, of a disturbing element in modernity, which is the fact that once you have created the situation, once you have displaced all of these religious impulses, you are simply left again with the idea that everything will corrupt. We have to find a new intellectual configuration. We have to arrive at a new progress towards a utopian idyll, something which exists out of time, ahistorically, but we try and manifest within the present, within Earth. And so, bound up in all of these concepts, you can say that modernity has sort of abandoned all shred of optimism. And I would say it's almost become, in that sense, incredibly passive. Modernity itself has become the religion. And I think that's actually bound up inextricably with the notion that time displaces God as an object of worship.
So how do you, at least in your own life, resituate God as an object of worship as opposed to time to the extent you can, given that we're creatures of modernity, we're under the water, and we can just at best perceive the glimmer across the aqueous membrane.
Well, for the simple fact again that any sort of notion of monotheism, I'm not sort of going to include polytheism in terms of this description because it's far more complicated a discussion to get into in terms of how um, ancient Greeks and people sort of looked at the sort of idea of the gods and the eternal sort of complexion of the gods. But at least from a Abrahamic and a Christian point of view, eternity is the way to situate not just eternity, but omnibenevolence. The idea that it's not simply that creation can exist beyond the idea of mortal concepts of time, but that there is a fundamental good associated with existence that should be sought. And that, in a sense, again, is the meaning of life fundamentally. If you reject the idea that there is a notion of the good intrinsically to the universe, and if you reject the idea of there existing something which is eternal in a situation which is already changing, that essentially is, regardless of your interpretation of scripture, regardless of your interpretation of theology, regardless of what denomination of Christianity you land on, or whether you're not a Christian at all. Neoplatonism also echoes many of these elements. Some of the Eastern religions and philosophies do as well. Um, if you abandon that notion, then I don't see how you can arrive at a position which, if not nihilistic, it's fundamentally pragmatic. And by that I mean we seek out morality and we seek out order for the sake of survival, basic primitive survival and social cohesion, so we don't basically end up in a state of permanent war and anarchy. That is the Hobbesian argument for the necessity of the Leviathan, for the necessity of the state. And you can say again, in terms of a post-religious paradigm, Hobbes is where we attempt to again find a solution to society's ills in legislation, in the state, in sublimating oneself again to an absolute authority and the idea of the primacy of the law as opposed to something older again, which is bound up with the idea of a inherently benevolent and everlasting entity.
All right. Well, unless you have any other burning topic that you feel relates that you want said, I'm good to wrap this up.
No, just thank you for having me on. And I understand that this can be quite intimidating again for people who have a passing or no familiarity with this subject. And in addition to thanking you again, I can only hope that I came across as semi coherent.
Definitely. Actually, if you'll humor one more question, I was going to raise this a little while back, and I think it's probably the main thing people would have trouble grasping. So, do you have time for one more question?
Shoot.
Yeah. Let's say that the Introuvable chamber had been successful and some sort of, I guess it would inevitably have to be some sort of absolutist monarchy had been reestablished with that restoration. How would that still be? And let's say you were around at this time and you had the Introuvable posture amidst the success of a restored absolutist monarchy. What would still be beyond that? And to what extent would you still feel like what you're surrounded by is symptomatic of decadence and tragedy?
Well, the fascinating thing, and thank you for asking me that question, because it's something that I've been dealing with on my channel quite extensively at the moment, which is that you can look at French history this is not true of all times, but this is simply an aspect of French history specifically, is that France, Gallican France, represented an ideological friction, which was how can we remain a uniformly Catholic state and prosecute wars against other Catholic powers? Because people understand, if you're a Christian and if you believe in the idea of Christendom, the res publica Christiana, then you shouldn't spend all your time waging wars on other Christian powers in order to glorify the state as exists. That was the criticism that was leveled at France for hundreds of years. And if you look at the final demise of monarchy in France, and if you look at, you could say, the triumph of republicanism in France, you can basically put it down to this contradiction of Gallicanism. After the Restoration, as you mentioned, there was an attempt, you can say, at restoring some of the sacred elements of the pre-Restoration monarchy under Charles X, but that fails. We then have an attempt to restore the constitutional monarchy phase of the early French Revolution under Louis Philippe. That fails. And then under Napoleon III, we have a regime which is pairing his sort of international adventurism coupled with the defense of Catholic missionaries and Catholic populations across the world. And you can say essentially a populist program of massive building works, appealing to the agrarian population of France and appealing to the poor against the sort of bourgeois liberal capitalist class in Paris. And it does quite well. You can say, again, if you're trying to find another element of these refashionings of political systems, the Second Empire in France sort of fits quite nicely into that. But it falls afoul again of this idea of Gallicanism. It fails to prevent itself from falling into wars with other Catholic powers. And that worsens the situation, you can say, of conservatism in Europe drastically. And then it gets involved unnecessarily in a war with Prussia that destroys the Catholic project in France forever. So if you're going to again look at history as a series of tragic ironies, you can say that it begins with the Gallican posture of France in the 16th century, and it ends with the Gallican posture of France in the 19th century. But that again is not sufficient in terms of explaining why the French sort of the system fails. It's because absolutism absolutism, I would say, is not a natural state for any monarchy to exist in, because it fundamentally depersonalizes the monarchy. It makes the monarchy almost unaccountable, and all the vices and corruptions of an institution become inseparably associated with the monarchy itself. And so many of the critics of absolute monarchy were looking at the institution and saying, okay, well, we actually need to have a more decentralized France. We should be looking at making the local institutions of the Languedoc, of Brittany, of Santone, of Aquitaine, more vital. We shouldn't be looking at having a single solution which is provided on high for Paris. And this is why, when we look at the French Revolution, you can actually see that the French Revolution is this Gallican impulse, which I've alluded to, on steroids. Everything which is represented by the Gallican impulse, the appeal to French exceptionalism, the desire to nationalize all church property, the desire to thoroughly centralize France under a unitary regime in Paris, all of these things are extended. So the more you look at the intrinsic characteristics of monarchy in France, you can see that it's basically passing through, a Gordian knot phase, and you need to constantly be dealing with the deficiencies, the shortcomings of an idea like monarchy in France at all times, not simply presenting an idea of how the monarchy existed in 1774 and saying we should simply return to that notion. That is, again, coming back to my idea that it's not enough, if you're going to have a posture of being a quote unquote ultra when looking at history, to simply look at the past and want to recreate the past. One needs to try and learn lessons from the past, remedy the deficiencies of the past in order fundamentally to create the new, with the major asterisks, that because history is basically tragedy, time and the passage of time will ultimately destroy everything, that this will not last forever. And so long as you understand that, I mean, it's basically, if we look at wisdom as sort of coming to the understanding that we will all face oblivion, we will all die, you should also have that posture and reflect back on whatever you're essentially trying to create, that everything in life is transitory. That doesn't mean that we should abandon a notion of principles as existing eternally throughout all of time.
Well, thank you for coming on, and I would urge people to follow your YouTube channel. You've been putting out, especially lately, in the discussion about de-Christianizing France and Fenelon a few days ago. So thank you for all the work that you do.